Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us in the latest of CMI's 75th anniversary Leading Lights conversations. I'm Anthony Painter, I'm Director of Policy at CMI, and I'm honoured this afternoon to be joined by Lord Shinkwin. Lord Shinkwin has been a member of the House of Lords since November 2015. He has spent much of his career in charity public affairs and campaigning, working for charities such as Macmillan Cancer Support, Cancer Research UK, and the Royal British Legion. He's passionate about championing disability equality issues, both in the House of Lords, in the media, and beyond. Lord Shinkwin, welcome this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I'd just like, if I may, to thank CMI for inviting me to join the Advisory Council. It's been a really informative, really enjoyable experience, and I'm so pleased that you're focusing on the issue of EDI and showing management that it's an issue that deserves and needs to be taken really seriously. I'm also really encouraged that management and bodies like the CMI are doing so much good work and showing what can be done through best practice.
Lord Shinkwin, Kevin, if I may, that's very gracious, and thank you so much for those words. It's been an absolute delight to have you informing the thinking of the 75th anniversary advisory council. You've added incredible insights from your own experiences and professional knowledge, and indeed policy knowledge as well. So that's been incredibly gratefully received. And I should say, for those watching on Wednesday afternoon, the final report that has come out of those deliberations involving Lord Shinkwin and many others will be published next Thursday, so watch out for that. Now, let's start from the beginning, if you like, and it would be great to sort of explore your own experiences of disability throughout your life. But I guess my opening question is, what are the particular experiences that have shaped your own outlook?
So I've had a pretty unusual experience of disability in that there was so much stigma attached to it in the 70s and the 80s when I was growing up, that I didn't really regard myself as disabled, even though I spent much of my childhood in a hospital bed with my leg up in traction because I've got brittle bones, so I was breaking my legs, in particular, sometimes several times a year. So I can recall at least 2 or 3 birthdays and Christmases, so June and obviously December, spent in hospital. So I was rather cut off from normality, but I somehow, I don't know what it was. I imagine it was parents who are teachers or were teachers, that I still held on to the idea I was just someone who happened to break their bones a lot. And there was a definite before and after moment in my life that shaped my outlook on disability.
Let's go into that before and after moment, because it happened at a particular time in your life. And if you're happy to, do you want to share the experience and how some things changed for you?
So many of your colleagues and members of the CMI managers will know that most disabled people acquire disability during working age. I was someone who was born with a disability. I was born with a broken leg, but as I say, grew up certainly in my early years as almost an honorary non-disabled person. So, for example, I went to mainstream school until I was effectively kicked out by the state system because they were so frightened of being sued if I had a fracture. And so my mother took on a lot of work outside her day job to somehow cobble together the money to get me to a private day school. I then got a scholarship, and my parents taught at an independent school so that they didn't have to pay fees until almost the end of my education, which got me to university. However, you mentioned the before and after moment. That came at the age of 23 when I suddenly found I had to have life-saving neurosurgery. The lights would have gone out within 6 months had I not had it. That left me severely disabled, and it opened my eyes to the reality of disability discrimination. As one example, one experience that will never leave me was after the neurosurgery, not only could I not breathe independently for several weeks without oxygen, but even for 5 months afterwards, I had to breathe through a tube in my throat, tracheotomy, and then I had to learn to swallow again. But 3 years after neurosurgery, I had to have reconstructive throat surgery. Before I had that, I wasn't intelligible. I got turned away from a building because I couldn't make myself heard. And that really brought it, or understood rather, really brought it home. Wow, this is what it's like for some disabled people. And that really opened my eyes and has informed the attitudes, the approach that I've taken since 1996 when I had the surgery.
What is interesting there's many interesting facets within that experience. I mean, there's two things leap out for me immediately, and one is how actually before that moment or experience over a period of time, nonetheless there were structures that excluded you in terms of the state system not being able to accommodate you, despite the fact presumably you were relatively happy and able to develop in that environment. And then two, after the experience, how sort of cultures of exclusion start to come into the mix, and that shaped your experience as well.
I think that's such a good way of putting it, Anthony, structures, because so many barriers that disabled people face in the workplace environment relate to structures that aren't deliberately designed to exclude.
Yeah.
They're not deliberately designed to disadvantage. They aren't deliberately designed to prevent people from not only being recruited, but progressing and contributing and realizing their potential to their own personal benefit, but to those of the organizations in which they work. However, dismantling and removing those structures, those barriers, has to be deliberate, which is why CMI's work in this space is so important, because it helps people not only to reflect on what needs to be done, the benefits to be had across the piece by their removal, but it also gives them guidance on how they can remove those barriers and address those structures.
So interesting. And how do you think these experiences have changed the way or shaped the way is probably a better way of putting it, the way you approach equalities for those with disabilities?
Fundamentally, because I think what I've come to realise, and I see this every day in the House of Lords, is that there is a deficit of lived experience, whether that's in the policy shaping arena or whether it's in management. So I think, for example, of the fantastic progress facilitated by the 30% Club, and the way that we now have mandatory pay gap reporting, introduced, by the way, by a Conservative government. Sadly, the current government, and we can come on to this, seems embarrassed to build on that. But while the composition of boards hasn't yet fundamentally altered, although, for example, organisations like the FCA are accelerating changes to that by setting various targets, such as I think 40% of boards should be women. But I think the deficit of lived experience means that until we have disabled people around the table on merit, but around the boardroom table, in private companies, or decision-making table in organisations, then that lived experience isn't going to inform strategic decisions that any management group needs to take on behalf of not only its employees, but its clients, its customers. And so I think, going back to the previous point about structures, the decision to draw on that lived experience as an asset and a resource, that has to be very deliberate, and it has to be taken by the top, by very senior management, as a integrated strategic decision.
It's so important, and of course, everyone's experience is unique. When it comes to particular characteristics, there will be particular experiences which will be individualized but shared also. Are you sensing that there's an increasing willingness and openness and maybe even determination to engage with those who have lived experience, whether they be staff, managers, customers, as you say, or is there more of a sort of lip service approach where there's an approach towards lived experience at all?
So by business, yes. By government, no. A resounding no, which is such a shame. But let's focus on the positives first. So by business, I think there is a growing recognition that disability is a Cinderella. It's a poor relative of the equality, diversity and inclusion piece, and indeed looking at it from a more strategic angle, from the ESG piece, that actually if companies, employers, organisations are committing themselves as part of their brand, as part of their offering to customers, to clients, to ESG, I'm saying, look, we want to showcase our commitment to ESG. I think it's absolutely right, logical, and overdue that they should, at a management level, ask themselves, what are we doing on disability? In many cases, your members will be doing really good stuff on ensuring that they are more gender diverse, in terms of male-female ratio at management levels. They'll be doing stuff on ethnicity, sexual orientation. It's Pride Month, as many will know. But on disability, I wonder if it's still seen as something you put in the too difficult box. It's put aside for another time. Actually, I think managers are missing out big time by doing that, because, for example, the spending power of disabled households, i.e. households that contain one or more disabled persons, is estimated to be more than £250 billion. And yet, if I try to get into a major chain of sandwich makers for lunch after this interview on Victoria Street, which many will know, those who live in London among the audience, and the audience will know is within a few hundred yards of Parliament, I won't be able to get in. I won't be able to buy my sandwich because I'll be unable to mount the step in the wheelchair that I used to get there. So those businesses are missing out. They're treating my money as disabled. And what encourages me is that I'm hearing from senior management that clients to whom they're pitching are saying, what are you doing on disability? Customers, 20% of the population are estimated to be disabled. That's 14.1 million. So there's a huge customer base here that's lying untapped. I find that really encouraging. I just hope that some of your members and others who are tuning in today will scratch their heads and say, after this, how do we tap that market?
Yeah, so interesting. And going back to the point about ESG, there's an interesting discussion at the moment about ESG and how to approach it, with some criticism as well, because there is a claim that it sort of confuses sort of opportunity and organizational success, and you're describing some of those things in terms of the marketplace, but also there is the talent and thinking about organizational development, with the sort of ethical side. We're doing this because it's the right thing to do. And having been involved with the 75th Advisory Council conversations, I think what became apparent fairly early on for us is that enormous strides have been made by those who are approaching this on an ethical basis. But the wider message about the importance and opportunity and need and so on wasn't quite yet widespread enough. And indeed, our conclusions, and people can read it next week, is actually that inclusivity is a fundamental part of economic growth, innovation, organizational success, public services that can, and we talked about some public services already today, public services can meet the needs of those that they're there to serve. So I guess my question is, how can we move the debate from outside of just the sort of equity bubble into this real mainstream conversation? This is fundamental to the future of our economy and society.
There is so many important points, Anthony, that I agree with. For me, the conclusion I've reached is that management really is the key. I'm not just saying this because I'm speaking to a management audience, but essentially it comes back to a question, well, why is disability often not even on the agenda? Why do big companies, for example, I won't name one, but a very prominent global law firm, only a few years ago, pre-pandemic, so in the previous age almost, and I'd like to think that what they did can be consigned to history, because they announced to the world, look at us. Here is our D&I annual report. It didn't even mention disability.
Right.
So I think that the reason why disability wasn't mentioned is because we don't have any power. As a group of people with very varied experiences and needs like anyone else, a whole spectrum, we don't have power. And so therefore we are far more constrained, limited in our ability to affect decisions that affect our lives and the lives of non-disabled people. That's why management is the key. 14% of graduates are disabled. So when I talk about the decision, going back to your really important point about structures, having to be deliberate at senior management, what are we going to do not only to tap this market, as we've just been discussing, but in terms of moving the dial, as you've just mentioned that point, so that in 25 years' time, I'm not having an almost identical conversation, which I was having 25 years ago when I was the youngest member of the National Disability Council, advising the then Conservative government on the Disability Discrimination Act. What are we going to do to make the next 25 years different? What we're going to need to do is people after this interview, I would encourage your members in particular to go away and think to themselves, what are we going to do as a team in our organisation to actively recruit and promote and facilitate the progression of talented young disabled graduates so that within 10, 15, 20 years, they are knocking on the boardroom door. That's what's going to change things. So that the lived experience point that we were discussing, that lived experience is actually seen as a resource and helps change the decision-making conversation at the decision-making table.
I think this, to a certain extent, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think you are right about the centrality of managers and management to this. And going back to your example of the international law firm and their D&I report that didn't even mention disability, this agenda will have really moved forward when it's not about writing a D&I report. It's actually fundamentally ingrained in the day-to-day practice of organizations and is seen as critical to strategic success over time. That's the prize, I would have thought, in the next 10 years, where that sort of state of affairs is a widespread assumption, rather than having to rely on mobilizing power because it's such an obvious case and we just need to land it somehow.
I think that's absolutely right. The only point I'd add to that is that in 10, 15, 20 years' time, when boards are talking generically about what they are doing as an organisation, that not only is disability an integral part of the EDI piece, but also the EDI piece is ideally redundant because we're already there, but that ideally the people announcing to the world what they're doing would include those who have disabilities. So, for example, Steve Ingham, Chief Executive of FTSE 250 Page Group, with whom I've had the privilege of working closely in the recent past, is leading the way here. He acquired a disability as recently as March 2019, skiing accident, and he has used his position, is using his position to really drive change and to challenge people's preconceptions. And ideally, I'd like to see a situation where there is far more representation of disabled people like Steve Ingham in positions of power.
Yeah. I mean, we've focused a lot on the challenge. I think it's important to note any positive changes as well. And, you know, what have you noticed in the last sort of 10, 15, 20 years that has changed positively for disabled people within the workplace?
So the greatest change, ironically, has been brought about by the Disability Discrimination Act of 1995 that I advised the then government on implementing. and then the Equality Act 2010. I say ironically because, sadly, my party, I sit on the Conservative benches, seems embarrassed by the Disability Discrimination Act, very uncomfortable with enforcing or facilitating the enforcement of the Equality Act. But the positives flowing from that legislation, particularly the DDA, Disability Discrimination Act, is that disabled people like me are far more visible to your generation and to the generation that has gone through mainstream education since, because now disabled people can't be removed from the state mainstream system on account of their disability, as I was. Now, of course, there are still special schools where, as they were told in my day, where those who would benefit from the dedicated and expert support that they wouldn't get in the mainstream system can go. But in the main, the children, pupils going through mainstream education now are going through that system with their disabled peers. That is a massive step forward because far fewer of the current generation, and indeed the one that went before, see disabled people as the other. Unfortunately, senior management currently are still of my generation, where, of course, disabled people weren't nearly as visible, apart from maybe as charity cases. So actually, Anthony, no pressure, but it's your generation and the generation of some younger managers in the audience who I'm looking to make the change. And there's an awful lot to do. You say, let's look at the positives, and you're absolutely right to encourage me to do so. But I think we also need to consider the backdrop, which is that unfortunately, instead of moving forwards, and it's great that CMI is driving this agenda, but government, as I said, is not. We're falling backwards. On disability, we are going backwards, and the disability employment gap, for example, remains stubbornly hovering at about 30%. And that is at a time of record employment, where the numbers of disabled people in employment has increased, but that's against a trend of, as I say, record employment, and also of the incidence of disability of work, of people sharing that they are disabled, increasing. So actually, the government's recent claim, hey, look at us, aren't we wonderful, we've increased the number of disabled people in the workplace, is pretty hollow against the overall trend. So you've got the disability employment gap, you've got the fact that here in London, only 1/3 of tube stations are accessible. So we have a massive issue of how do we get to work? Yeah, as managers, how do we do that? Housing. So few of our houses or flats in major cities are accessible. So where do managers live if they have a disability? Where their disabilities can be accommodated so that they can live independently and work. Those are just a few examples of the challenges that still apply and that need to be addressed by today's management.
So you've now finally tempted me into a conversation around policy and politics, and let's just cover that one off very very briefly. But you reference, which you had some involvement with, the 1995 Disability Discrimination Act, introduced under a Conservative government. The Equalities Act was introduced and passed by a Labour government, if my memory serves correctly, but implemented under a Conservative government. The gender pay gap reporting requirements were brought in under a Conservative government. So, the Conservatives have been at the heart of this agenda and driving it forward over a long period of time. There does seem to be a sense, and this came up in our sort of deliberations connected to the 75th anniversary work, that just recently the government's become a bit distracted by sort of red tape on one hand and not wanting to burden business, and maybe the sort of cultural political conversation we've had on the other side, and maybe missing the bigger picture of the types of opportunities that we're talking about. I don't know whether that's a fair way of summing up where we are.
I think that's a very charitable way of summing up where we are. I probably won't be as charitable because as a Conservative, and you mentioned opportunity, and that's why I am a Conservative and believe strongly that Conservatives should be leading the equality of opportunity debate. I feel that this government, for whatever reason, sadly seems to have lost sight of the obligation, the duty that we have as Conservatives, always to look for opportunities to extend the ladder, never to pull it up behind us. And with, for example, its consistent, dogmatic, ideological disdainful dismissal of extending mandatory workforce reporting from gender beyond gender, I think we are at risk of being seen as a party that pulls the ladder up behind us and is perfectly comfortable to do so. I find that really odd, because as a Conservative, I'm delighted that we've got the most ethnically diverse cabinet ever. Yeah, I take real encouragement from that. I think it's absolutely fantastic. It's moved far beyond anyone's ability to say, oh, well, it's purely tokenistic. We have major decision makers around the cabinet table who have lived experience of discrimination and prejudice on the grounds of ethnicity. We now need to reflect on how, as a party and as a government, we can build on that in a very Conservative way and address your point, Anthony, which I think is absolutely right, that opportunity is central to that. And perhaps, if I may, I could just look or highlight as an example a scheme that the flagship scheme, employment scheme of the Conservatives for people with disabilities. It's called Disability Competence. It's not widely known. I think CMI has found that. I know that other business organisations have found there's low level awareness, but also, and I would say this is understandable, a low level of engagement, because actually disability competence is what my English teacher would have said, an oxymoron. It doesn't command the competence of business, and it certainly doesn't command the competence of its primary stakeholders, which is disabled people. Or are disabled people. So, just as an example, only 1.33% of the UK's employers are members of Disability Competence. There are three layers. Two, the first two only require employers to mark their own homework in terms of what they're doing on disability. Level 3 requires employers to, in effect, have peers review what they're doing. And there's a very revealing statistic that the Disability at Work group of academics from business schools like the Warwick Business School and City Business School have found, which is that almost half of all disability competent employers are located in the voluntary or public sector. Many of them are mandated to be members if they're in the public sector. So actually the level of engagement is way below 1.33%, which is, not wanting to be too unkind, it is pretty pathetic, to be honest. So to go back to my earlier point, I draw strength quite literally from the work that management are doing, irrespective of what government is doing. Too often, I think, all of us fall into the trap of waiting for the green light from government. Oh, we can't do this, government hasn't given us permission. And actually, thankfully, CMI and other business organisations are saying, we don't need the government's permission to do the right thing, but also to go back to the crucial point you made, the best thing for business, the best thing for us.
Yeah, and disability confidence is a great scheme. It sounds like a real opportunity for government, public services, and business put their shoulder behind that particular wheel. And you can't help but noticing, yesterday the labour market data came out. You referenced a 30% employment gap for those who are disabled against those who are not. And we have record vacancies and increasing vacancies in the economy. You can't help but put those two threads together and think about, actually, is there something more proactive that can be done here?
I think so. And I think so much of it is about giving signals. So I don't believe that government should burden business unnecessarily. I do think it has a crucial role in facilitating the creation of a level playing field and enabling managers who not only want to do the right thing, but the best thing for their business in terms of harnessing diverse talent for the success of their business, enabling them to do so on a level playing field. What do I mean by that? So, for example, if there were mandatory workforce reporting in terms of the numbers of disabled people in the workforce, but also where are they in the pay grade quartiles for big organisations of 250 employees or more, so that you actually can track progression. Without that, how can the management of organisations, big organisations, as I say, 250 employees plus, go out to the market, whether that's to graduates to say, hey, come and work for us, bearing in mind 14% of them are disabled, whether it's to customers saying, hey, we want more of your business, or whether it's to clients saying, we want your business as well. How can they do that? How can they showcase the excellent work that they're doing when they're not competing on a transparent, consistent, level playing field that data that was published would allow them to do? So without harnessing the power of data on a fair, on a consistent and transparent basis, it's so much harder for managers who want to do this to do so on a competitive basis. I believe that until government introduces the necessary changes, actually it's actually being a roadblock to progress, a roadblock to reform.
Yeah, and next week we'll be very clear how important data is of different types: quantitative data, relative data like pay gap reporting, of course, benchmarking, understanding your data, being transparent about your data as an organisation, government supporting that, but also responding to what your data is telling you, being proactive in that regard. And the evidence, I think, from gender pay gap reporting is those who take it really seriously, they respond to the challenging messages. So spreading it to other areas, it would seem, could have a similarly positive effect over time. Now, we've had a very energetic conversation in the sidebar, and I want to bring in some of the voices who have contributed quietly to the conversation. I want to bring them into the live conversation. I'm going to just sort of read out a comment from Stephen Dean. And he remarks that your comment that disability is the correlation in equality, diversity, and inclusion equation is interesting and thought-provoking. And he asks, are we dealing with all aspects of a requirement, or are we just sort of cherry-picking some easier elements to deal with?
So I can totally understand, as a former manager myself, in the voluntary sector and in the commercial sector, that the temptation is to always pick the lowest hanging fruit. So as I say, I can totally understand the temptation to do that. And that's why I think it's so important that government sets the framework and actually facilitates change. Because at the moment, an increasing number of managers, whether they're in the business sector, particularly in the business sector, or in the public voluntary sector, are wanting to do the right thing, but they need to be to be helped to do the right thing by, as I say, a level playing field. Just to give you an example, government often, this government in particular, says, oh, this can't be done, it won't wash, or business won't buy it. Actually, businesses are already doing what government says can't be done. So to go back to gender pay gap reporting, it wasn't until government said, we're going to introduce this, that businesses said, okay, we're going to make this work. And it hasn't yet overhauled the composition of boards, although, as I said earlier, organisations like the FCA are setting targets, which is the right thing, I feel. It has changed the conversation around the boardroom table and put gender on the agenda as never before. And so you often need a trigger, you often need a signal to set the ball rolling, to get the process started. And I think the same applies to disability. So I think Stephen's absolutely right that we're not dealing with all aspects. But to go back to the point about, or my point rather, about companies are leading the way, I think of, for example, Clifford Chance, of EY and others, who are already reporting on pay gap across all four of the major protected characteristics under the equality law, including disability. One final point on this, if I may, is some of the managers on this call, listening to this interview, may be saying, yes, but how do I get my employees to declare, to disclose that they have a disability? I would say so much of it is about leadership. It's about your senior management, the tone they strike, the commitment they show to EDI across the piece. But it's also about language and narrative. So when you recruit and when you have that first interview, if you're a big organisation, for example, with a disabled employee, or an employee that hasn't declared they're disabled, do you couch it in terms of what reasonable adjustments would you need if you're disabled? Or do you couch it generically as what can the organisation do to ensure you can realise your potential and give your best to the company. In other words, just as, for example, various organisations have done on LGBTQ+, how can we ensure that you feel comfortable and confident to bring your whole self to work and give of your best? I can't see why any organisation wouldn't want to ask that question of all their employees, and indeed at recruitment of all their potential employees.
I think that's a very elegant and important reframing of perspective. We've had some comments from Waller B via YouTube. Waller remarks, this is an interesting reframing of the challenge as well, actually. Waller remarks, we need to acknowledge that at some stage in our lives, we will become disabled, short or long term, visible or hidden. So let us care for each other in the workplace and beyond. Let's break down the barriers of ignorance and stigmatization. And managers need to be adequately trained on the impacts of disabilities at work. So there's a reframing around understanding that this may be something that we have to experience, even if for a short period of time at some point during our working lives.
Absolutely. And for me, that goes back to the point about the key question you asked, Anthony, about what is the biggest positive change you've seen over your lifetime, and it's a visibility question. It's the mainstreaming of disability, particularly through disabled pupils now going through mainstream education. And I think the person that asking the question is absolutely right. Disability is inevitable to a greater or lesser extent. For me, it's not just about kindness, although I totally agree with the questioner. It's also about self-interest. And I think that was implied by the questioner. So I'm not saying the person who asked the question has overlooked that in any way. I'm just saying that as with so many motives in any decision that we will take, people tuning into this today, most of us have to put our hands up and say the decisions we take today will be guided by self-interest. I think that applies to whether we factor in disability in our strategic managerial decisions. But I think it also relates to the point that we're far more likely to factor in disability if it's not seen as an issue affecting other people, but as an issue affecting our own colleagues, indeed, maybe our own manager, whom we obviously want to impress and please, we want to treat as an equal. In terms of as an equal citizen, even though, of course, they may be our line manager and therefore superior to us in the management line of command.
I know it was Tristan Unwin that made the point about the importance of seeing disabled people in strategic decision-making roles. I think a point that, Kevin, you made early on in the conversation you'd agree wholeheartedly with. Now, we have, there's an anonymous question, but I'm going to put it to you anyway because it's a challenge, and it's important, I think, in this agenda that any concerns or doubts are heard, because I think we've got to take everyone along with us on this journey. So it's important that people can raise their objections and we discuss them openly. And the anonymous user says mandatory reporting rules can sometimes negatively impact the groups it's designed to help. Gender pay gap reporting, for example, will simply make some companies find clever and subtle ways to stop offering roles to women at entry grade, which of course will limit opportunities for women. So I guess the question is, do you see a danger in some of these approaches, or are there ways of overcoming those dangers?
First of all, I really appreciate the question. I agree with you. It's so important to address these issues. I think it's about balancing risk. I think there are always lessons to be learnt from changes such as the introduction of mandatory pay gap reporting on gender. I think overall, it has been a positive step forward. I think that more and more decisions are being taken by increasingly gender-balanced boards. I don't think anyone should be in the position of feeling they need to make an apology for that. How could one possibly apologise for that progress, which is so long overdue? I just think, for example, in politics, and I appreciate this wasn't reliant on mandatory pay gap reporting and possibly had more to do with the handbag being wielded. But within about 50 years of women being given equal suffrage, which only happened, I think, in 1928, because until then there was still some age discrimination that didn't apply to men. Within a relatively short period of time, after millennia in which men had said, "Oh, women are inferior to us," we had a woman prime minister. And in my view, excuse me, in my view, I'm just going to sip some water if I may.
Take some water, please do. Please do.
In my view, a very strong and very important historically, whatever one thinks of her as an individual, a very strong leader in Margaret Thatcher. So I think that changing the conversation is a very positive thing. And in terms of changing it around the boardroom table, it did not happen by accident. But DDA effected the change such as the one I mentioned of greater visibility of disabled people. It did not happen by accident. There were massive protests leading up to it by disabled people for their equality, for their rights. And I don't know if we're at the moment in time where a similar thing has to happen on equality again for disabled people. But I think going back to the doubts that were expressed by your questioner, for me, one of the most important points is that any company, any organisation thinking of being transparent about their data as it relates to workforce in terms of disability, ethnicity, maybe sexual orientation, subject to anonymity, so it could only be for really big companies, that they are reassured that certainly as far as I'm concerned, there needs to be contextualization. That organizations, management aren't thinking, right, they're going to be setting themselves up to fail. That's not the objective. The objective is to move in a far more positive direction that I feel CMI is advocating, I'm certainly advocating, and that openness in terms of reporting, using data to report on progress is a really good thing, but it must be contextualized. It must take into account, for example, that we will be starting inevitably from a very, very low level baseline. So, for example, I just put this out there, Anthony, as a legislator, as a parliamentarian, I would not be averse to phasing it in, to saying, right, okay, we're going to give organisations represented by people in the audience today, maybe 3 years to prepare for this. But they need to know when it's coming, they need to know what's required, and they need to engage with disabled people so that they get it right when the deadline comes. But when the deadline comes, it also needs to be understood that the expectation is this is change subject to a timeline. Nothing is going to be radically changed overnight. We want to take business, the public sector, the voluntary sector with us. I hope that really reassures people who are thinking, oh my goodness, how would we cope with this? How would we do this? I think it's possible. I think that, as I mentioned, EY, Clifford Chance and others are already showing it can be done.
Changing topic slightly, very, very briefly, but this is a very general question I'm going to ask, but I'd be interested to get some quick thoughts. And it's the role of technology. Do you broadly see that, obviously, a range of technologies as a sort of force for inclusion or risk further exclusion of disabled people?
As ever, it depends on how it's used. Algorithms in recruitment have been shown worryingly to actually discriminate and build discrimination to an even greater degree into the system. So that has to be guarded against. So, for example, research has shown that non-identifiable recruitment produces more gender diverse results. That consistently, where it's clear that the applicant is male or is white, that that will result in outcomes that favour the white male. So there are ways that technology can be used in, for example, recruitment positively, as long as the risks are taken into account and methods are built into the system that actually mitigate those risks. Then, for example, in the workplace, I think technology, particularly for those who have visual impairments, maybe who are neurodiverse, maybe for those who have hearing impairments, it's absolutely essential. So, for example, for those who have hearing impairments and who are working remotely, captions on the screen will be particularly important. So Zoom, Teams, other online mechanisms, it will be absolutely essential that the technology is inclusive. Similarly, for those with visual impairments, being able, where appropriate, where applicable, to either be able to listen, so have an audio function to what would otherwise appear as text, or to be able to magnify. That's incredibly important.
Great, thank you. Now, we've got 60 seconds left, so I'm going to ask 3 really quick-fire questions. The first is from Becky. What advice would you have for those leading organisations on how to ensure people in a position where they've acquired disabilities are able to continue their career wherever possible? One piece of advice.
For managers, make sure you set a culture and a tone in which people are confident and comfortable to bring their whole self to work.
What would a better, fairer society look like to you?
Where disabled managers are more visible.
And a brief statement summarising the impact managers make every day.
I think managers overwhelmingly make a very positive impact every day. I loved managing my teams. I miss it tremendously. It's possibly the thing I miss most in being a member of the House of Lords, even though it's an immense privilege and opportunity, just as participating in this interview has been today.
Thank you. Lord Shinkwin, it's been an absolute honour, and thank you so much for sharing your experience, insights, and considerable knowledge to this discussion. All that's left for me to say is for our viewers to look out for the reports that are coming very, very soon, and also look out for Lord Shinkwin and his ongoing campaigns in Parliament and elsewhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you, CMI.